Holy Gospel according to John, the 2nd chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, Jesus drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. Jesus also poured out the coins of the money changers, and he overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But Jesus was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
I imagine you've been hearing, on the news, all around us, everywhere you turn, about AI, right? Artificial intelligence. I tried looking up a concise definition of what artificial intelligence is, but the best I could find was a scientist who said, there is no one definition of artificial intelligence. It's really about building machines that do smart things. So I guess the term smart can be relative, because if you've been hearing what I've been hearing, while AI has come a long way, it still has a very long way to go. So one example of what AI can do is it can produce art. So it can take samples of art, whether it's music or visual arts or any kind of thing like that, from all over the internet, and it takes those things and it teaches itself to produce its own version of art. So you can take an AI program, you can open it, and you can say, make a picture of fill in the blank. And it'll produce it. Maybe good, maybe not, I don't know. But recently I've seen this image going around. Someone asked AI to produce an image of Jesus flipping over tables, like we just heard in the gospel story today. And this is the picture that it produced. I guess you can't argue with that. I mean, it is Jesus flipping over a table, or maybe more literally, Jesus doing a flip over a table. I don't know. But I guess this is what AI still has to learn. There are nuances in language. There can be multiple meanings in language. We can hear things different ways. Language can change and evolve over time. I think we should always consider that we might not always interpret things the way they were originally meant, and stay open to hearing and thinking about it in new ways. We don't see it in this artwork today, but today's gospel reminds us that Jesus' ministry was not only about bringing love and healing to the lost or hope and salvation to his followers, but it also involved a great deal of disruption and turning the tables, literally, on the powers and understandings of this world. With God active in this world, there should be a significant change in how we see and understand things. So for the past few weekends of Lent this year, we've been hearing Old Testament stories that tell us about God's covenants with humans throughout history. We also hear one today, and we'll hear ones in the next 2 weekends as well. I think I may have neglected to dig into what exactly a covenant is in either of these last 2 weeks. So without stating the obvious, a covenant is a promise. It's an agreement between two parties. Right? 2 weeks ago, we heard about the covenant that God made with Noah. After the flood subsided and Noah and his family and all the animals left the ark and stepped foot finally again on dry land, we hear how God makes a covenant with Noah and a covenant ultimately with all of us. God hung a bow, a rainbow in the sky, so that upon seeing it, God would remember the promise that God would never again destroy all of life with a flood. Last weekend, we heard God's covenant with Abram and Sarai. That a covenant that they would be led to a land, and that a land that would become theirs. A covenant that said that they would have a child and that they would become the ancestors of a multitude for generations to come. We heard it was a covenant that evolved from the promise of just land to the promise of countless descendants through time. So these were covenants that God made with us, human beings, despite their flaws and failings, despite them not always following the right path, despite them not always being sure of what ultimately was to come. Still, despite all of that, God promised them an outcome that always remained true. So what might these covenants mean to us now? Or what might covenants in general mean to us now? I've been on enough trips with groups of youth to know that the best outcome of that trip is guaranteed by the creation of a group covenant. It's a covenant that the members of the group, the youth and adults, come up with together. And it's a way of saying that this is how I promise to act and treat you, while at the same time you promise to act and treat me the same, so that our relationship together as this group can be the best for everyone. So the covenants that God is making, whether it's with Noah or Abram and Sarai, these feel like they have the same purpose as those group covenants we make now. God is establishing a relationship. Yes, there are things that God calls them to do. There's things we have to do as part of that relationship, but it's meant for a purpose that they will complete together. It defines how God envisions this life together. God with us with God. So as we heard, today's Old Testament readings bring us the Ten Commandments, the words that God gives to Moses to pass on to the people. Another fancy word that describes these things is the Decalogue. Deca means 10, and log comes from the word logos, which means words. So here we have the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, and sometimes called the 10 Words. I've said this before, and I still believe that more than being just rules to follow, these 10 words, these 10 commandments, could also be seen as 10 covenants. 10 promises made between God and the Israelites, between God and us. 10 reminders of what this relationship looks like between God and us. I wonder if we think of it in that way, does that change how we hear the commandments? As a hope and a promise of a relationship with God and with our neighbor, rather than just a rule to follow or else. If you were here a few Wednesdays ago during our midweek service, I mentioned how there are many of us who, when given a rule or command, almost see it as a challenge not to follow it. Someone once told me, if I'm given a rule, I'm going to break it. In light of these other covenants that we've heard in these past weeks, what might God's desire be from these 10 commandments? Listen to how God gives them to the people. God says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. The Israelites who Moses was giving these words to were not called to do these things in order to receive something from God. They were called to do them because they had already received something from God. Their freedom from slavery and the promise of a new life in a new land. And their life together, shaped by these covenants, would further reflect the freedom that they had and they received from God. I think, again, it goes back to what I said about why we make this group covenant before spending time together. A covenant says that this is how I promise to act and treat you, while you promise and act to treat me the same, so that our relationship together as a group can be the best for everyone. Might that be the same kind of covenant God is making with us through this Decalogue, these 10 words, these 10 commandments? I so often look out at us, at all of us, and at all of Christianity, really. And I wonder why our faith has seemed to become so transactional. Maybe it's because I'm becoming too cynical or not seeing a full picture of everything, but it seems like I see people trying to bargain with their faith, bargain with God through what they can do, or even do evangelism through threats. We'll say, I'm going to follow God's commandments because if I don't, God's going to punish me. But if I do follow the commandments and if I live a good life, I will be rewarded. God will be pleased with me and I get to go to heaven. All of you, no, not you all, the people out there, all you people out on the streets during worship, you need to get your butts in church or else we're all going to be destined for hell. But come with me. Come to church with me. We'll get rewarded together. Actually, I might get a bigger reward because I brought someone in with me, but do we too often live in the way of the commandments because we expect something in return? Namely, a place in heaven when we die. Think about all these covenants, these promises that God has been making in the early part of the Bible. God, with Noah, has promised to let life continue and thrive without the threat of destruction. God, with Abram and Sarai, is promising land and descendants to the children of them, not because of how faithful they were, but because God was working through them and with them. And now God has rescued the Israelites from slavery. God has given them their freedom, is now pointing them to a land where they can prosper and grow by living in a way that shows honor and love and thanksgiving to God and respect to one another. Instead of thinking that we have to obey these rules, could we say that we get to live in this way with God and with each other because of what God has gifted us with? Down the road, long after these covenants, we continue to see the work of God through the life and death of Jesus. Today's story of Jesus flipping tables and clearing out the temple, it's a story that occurs in all 4 Gospels, which is something that's kind of rare. But when Matthew and Mark and Luke tell this story, they include it at the end of Jesus' ministry, after he has triumphantly entered Jerusalem, almost as a way of Jesus saying, have you not listened to anything I've said? But the version we heard this morning, which comes from John's Gospel, John actually places it at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Besides the miracle at the wedding at Cana that Jesus did, this is one of Jesus' first public acts, according to John. I feel like John is saying that Jesus is setting the stage to show everybody that this kind of faith practice, a faith that is transactional, that God's people have kind of evolved into doing for so long, and in particular here in the temple, praying on the poor and vulnerable, that kind of faith does not reflect the covenant life that God has established. And so Jesus continues in the gospel to show what that covenant life looks like, showing us that God wants all of us to live in a way of love and relationship and hope. So these laws are meant to liberate us. These promises are meant to free us to live in the goodness of God. These covenants show us that life in God is completely opposite of what we've often come to expect, which I think we all know can be a good thing. Amen.